So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name's Will Trevor. I'm the Director of Programs and Operations here at the Tufts Gordon Institute at Tufts University in Boston. Welcome to our keynote debate, leadership in the post-pandemic world. Do we need to rethink the role of the leader? Now, the aim of these debates is to bring together a group of leading thinkers, both practitioners and academics, to discuss and debate a topical issue at the intersection of leadership, innovation, management and entrepreneurship. Our aim is to help nurture and develop the next generation of transformational leaders who act with purpose and heart and informed about the relevant topics of the day. Now, today's debate is doubly important because it also marks part of our ongoing celebration of the 30th anniversary of the Tufts Gordon Institute. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce Kevin Ohe, who is the Executive Director of the Tufts Gordon Institute, who'd just like to say a few words by way of introduction.
Thank you very much, Will, and welcome everyone, excuse me, to our third panel. With all that's happening in the world, the need for leaders and leadership is even ever more critical. Yet in times of rapid change, it takes dynamic leadership, not recipe-driven leadership, to set new directions and transform our world for good. Today, as part of our mission to provide a forum for open debate around critical issues facing our world, we bring together thought leaders from across the spectrum, from startups to large corporation, educators to practitioners. And to bring the startups perspective, this leadership session is co-sponsored by USASB, the United States Association for Small Business and Entrepreneurship, the TechSig Group. Julian Shield, the president of USASB, has graciously joined our panel today. I thank her and all of today's panelists for carving the time. And I encourage all of you to speak with your hearts, as it's through hearing without judgment that we all move closer to understanding and action. I look forward to the session. Will, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks again to USASB and Julianne Shields for being part of this panel today. Next slide, please. So here at the Tufts Gordon Institute, we offer a range of programs from the undergraduate through to professional education. And in spring of 22, the Tufts Gordon Institute, we launched a redesigned MSCM, MS in Engineering Management. It leverages the best of our award-winning on-campus and online MSCM programs and re-envisioned into a single top-tier graduate program that prepares leaders for the new world of work. Not only does the Tufts MSCM deliver relevant content and practical skills you need to thrive in an increasingly complex and rapidly changing world, but it also provides you with an exceptional part-time graduate experience that you can fit into your busy life. Now, the MS in Innovation and Management is a full-time accelerated program designed for people who want to make things happen. You're passionate about science, technology, engineering or math. People who believe new solutions will solve our toughest challenges and make this a better world. If you're a recent STEM graduate who wants to accelerate your career and be at the forefront of developing new ideas, then the MSIM program will provide you with the product innovation, marketing, finance and leadership skills you need to be a new leader in today's technology-driven world. So now I'd just like to introduce you to the panelists. We have an extremely qualified and experienced group of panelists today. Panelists, if I can ask you just to be off camera just for a little bit longer, and then ask you to bring your cameras on. We've got Scott Bohannon, who's President and CEO of the Centre for Creative Leadership. We have Dr. Kenneth Harris, who is Chief Strategist of Talented Strategies and also a faculty member. We have Samantha Carlin, who is CEO of Empower Global, and also a double jumbo, meaning that she has 2 degrees from Tufts. And as Kevin just mentioned a moment ago, we also have Julianne Shields, who's President and CEO of USASB. We have Scott Hilton, who is a member of faculty here at the Gordon Institute. He's also an angel investor and writer. And we're also very fortunate to be joined by Barbara Kellerman, who's founding executive and executive director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. Now, each of our panelists are far more than that very brief introduction that I've given you. And my colleague Wei will just be posting a far more detailed biography together with the LinkedIn connections for each of those contacts. Now, just a few words on the format of the event. And panelists, if you'd like to turn on your cameras at this point, that would be appreciated. So just a few words on the format. I will call upon each of the panelists to make just a quick 5-minute pitch. We call it a keynote debate. And so all that we do is ask that each talk about the idea of should we be reimagining the role of the leader. And then after that, we'll move into a discussion round. There are some questions to be asked, but also we would ask you, the audience, to post into the Q&A your questions, so we can crowdsource the questions as well. Panelists, if I can remind you, we have a very informed and interested audience here today, but obviously not everybody is a specialist in the field of leadership. So if you mention industry terms and concepts that you think will be unfamiliar to a general audience, then I'd be grateful if you could just give a further explanation or definition to assist the audience. But firstly, if I could call upon you, Scott Bohannon, if you'd like to start off with your circa 5-minute pitch around the topic of the debate today.
Well, I'd be happy to, and Will, thank you for inviting me to join the panel today. I'll start off by saying I don't believe that the way we need to lead has changed since the pandemic, at least not any more than it needed to change beforehand. To explain why, I'll start with a long time ago, back in the 1500s. Many science historians agree that Tycho Brahe was probably the greatest scientist of all time. Elegance of his hypotheses, the sophistication of his experiments, inventiveness of his measurement tools, clarity of his observations really just put him in a select class. But sadly, despite his brilliant mind and methods, Tycho Brahe failed in his lifelong scientific quest. Perhaps the greatest scientist to ever live spent his whole life trying to answer one question, which is, what are the forces of nature that cause the sun to revolve around the earth? Well, it was a bad question, right? Because it was built on a bad assumption. When Tycho Brahe died in 1601, his plaintive last words were, may it not be that I've lived in vain. And those words were recorded by his new assistant, Johann Kepler. Well, today, Kepler is regarded as the father of modern astronomy. He gave us the 4 laws of planetary motion that are still at the heart of the discipline. But in his lifetime, he actually never performed a single experiment or took a single reading of his own. All of his breakthroughs were based on the data painfully amassed by Tycho Brahe during his repeated failures. Right? Kepler was able to find so much value in the data that caused Brahe such despair, because shortly after Brahe's death, he asked himself a simple question: what if the Earth revolves around the sun? Then what does the data say? Now, I started with that story because when it comes to leadership, I don't think we've been asking the right questions. We've had a lot of theories about what makes a good leader. The great man theory, the traits theory, behavior, contingent situational theory, transactional transformational, some would argue agile, and on. And all these theories have been about answering the question, what's the best way for someone, the leader, to get a group of people from point A to point B? And point B might be a goal of some kind, or a change in behavior, or whatnot. Starting about 50 years ago, our research on leadership took a decidedly quantitative turn. We started churning the data to understand which leadership behaviors were more likely to get you to point B, or which leadership behaviors were more likely to get you positive feedback from the people you led and your colleagues. Now, that analysis has converged on behaviors like empathy, influence, collaboration, building trust, right? These are all generally good behaviors. I'd argue, though, that you can get more out of studying the last 2 seasons of Ted Lasso than studying the results of all that research. And I say that even though my organization wrote a lot of that research, and I think it's quite good. The problem is that by focusing on the achievement of goals or feedback about the leader, we've overlooked the fact that how you lead can create great benefits or do great harm in its own right, regardless of goal attainment or likability. Indeed, most leaders who rely on empathy, influence, collaboration, fostering trust, still inadvertently diminish the capacity and well-being of the people they lead. And that's because we haven't been explicitly factoring in ensuring that how we lead can also make basic human needs like dignity, equity, agency, choice, hope, health abundant rather than scarce. When we make a basic human need like dignity abundant for someone we lead, their dignity becomes an immense resource for the other people in their lives. When we make health abundant in how we lead, our people's health also becomes a resource for others. Even if we don't achieve a goal, but still lead in such a manner, we create abundance and we can still do enormous good. By contrast, even if we achieve a goal, if we do it in a way that diminishes people, of course, we can do great harm. And that's always been true. The pandemic didn't change the way we need to lead, but it brought into stark relief for many people the scarcity of basic human needs. It forced us to start asking different questions about what good leadership actually looks like. And that may turn out to be an enduring gift of the pandemic. Hopefully, we're going to be more likely to stop and ask ourselves, what is the best way to lead from point A to point B so that we also cultivate the conditions and practices for current and future generations of stakeholders in a community to thrive in abundances of human equity, dignity, agency, choice, genuine hope, without causing scarcity of those resources for other communities or any generations to follow. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Scott. Just a reminder to folks, if you have any questions, the Q&A is open if you'd like to post your questions in there. And now going through the panelists in alphabetical order. Kenneth, would you like to give us your 5-minute pitch?
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me today. I'll try to keep as we talked about, my personality in check. How's that? Going through this, I had to, in a nutshell, look at the question, do we need to rethink the role of leadership? And so my answer is an unequivocal yes, in the sense that components need to be added to the relationship between leader and those being led. I believe it's the role of the leader to incorporate and transfer self-leadership elements into the workplace interactions. So my question is, how do people want to be led? That is what we need to really look at. Challenges have included uncertainty, unpredictability, issues with safety, conflicting information, conflicting viewpoints. I read across an article by Corn Ferry, and in the article, The Coronavirus Leadership Challenges, it said that the leader must be all those things my former colleague talked about. You have to be calm, you have to be confident, you have to be positive and courageous and empathetic, resilient. You have to have a vision, all those things that leaders always do. But this means that education, training, and experience is available for employees need to be competent in ways that serve them personally, making them better in the workplace. And so my suggestion is that we use self-leadership as that way or that strategy to move forward. We need to allow the employee to be able to visualize successful performance instead of being told. Self-goal setting, what we talked about earlier. Self-talk, how you communicate with yourself makes you better and then makes you be able to communicate with others. How do you reward yourself? Not always looking toward the organization to reward you for every single thing. Have a candid conversation about how you evaluate beliefs and assumptions you make about the organization. Self-punishment, self-observation, but then really focusing on what those natural rewards are so that the person in the workplace can feel in a way that they're naturally rewarded and they don't have to always work towards those HR bells and whistles. And then just plain self-cueing. How do you cue yourself? How do you remind yourself? These are some of the things that you need to work toward. So then I think employees hold the key to the future of business, and it's incumbent upon leaders to actually ensure that the employee has every tool possible so that they can help themselves be the best person for themselves first, and then for the company.
Thank you, Ken. Scott Hilton.
Thank you very much for the panel and the topic. This is a key area that I've been focused on in some of my work. I would say, to take slightly a contrary position, I don't think we have to radically rethink leadership. I think the elements, similar to what Scott said earlier, the elements of what we need to do as leaders has been in play for decades. And in certain industries, farther along than others. I think what the pandemic, the Great Resignation, the shift to remote has done is made that a critical element for all industries and all sectors of the economy as opposed to certain ones. So if you think about consulting industry, some of the high-tech industry, software, cloud, they've been dealing with remote teams, distributed teams, flat organization, using Agile to accelerate and build an iterative product model for decades now. What I think has changed is that imperative has now been pushed to everybody. And that's why it feels so dislocating, is that with the advent of the mobility of workers, the technology to allow work from anywhere, the rise of automation is disrupting how we do work and what the role of the leader is in enabling the best out of their teams. And what, we've been hearing this for most of our careers, this idea is leader as enabler. And I think we are there. Your job as a leader is not to direct work. Your job as a leader is to set the vision for your organization and then provide the enabling processes and empathy and training so that your teams can be effective at their jobs. And that really is about building up your communications and your ability to nurture your organization as opposed to direct your organization. So I think that's the shift. And another one that I think is really, and I come from the software industry, is really a fundamental thing of thinking about the work your teams do is not output, but of outcomes. And if you give the teams an outcome and let them figure out how to do it, then you don't have to worry about the output.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Samantha Carlin, if I can come to you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for letting me be here, inviting me onto this panel. Like I said, I am a proud double jumbo. I was just at Tufts this weekend for my Fletcher reunion. So I told, well, I'm happy to do anything for Tufts students. So I do believe that the role of leader is changing, and that's what I built my whole career on. And it's really, I know this is about corporate America, but what I'm seeing is you cannot avoid what's going on in the world just because you're at a company. I mean, in the past week alone, the war in Ukraine is raging on. We just saw a mass murder of elementary school students for the second time, a mass murder of people of color in New York, thousands and thousands of people protesting the possible overturn of abortion rights in America. I mean, this is literally just in the past week. And so I think one of the things that we have to think about as leaders, and as somebody who is a diversity and inclusion practitioner, is that leaders more and more, even in corporate America, need to take political stances. Companies now are making the decision, should I say something about abortion? Because what's happened in the US is it's become politicized, but it really is a public health issue. It's a women's health issue. But companies need to take a stand if they care about the women in their organization. Same thing as Black Lives Matter. I mean, that was a huge, it's still going on because of this unbelievable inequality that has existed for so long, that has silenced the voices of Black people and submitted them to unnecessary violence. Okay, so that means that if you are a leader in the workplace today, these conversations are not going to be left outside of work. People don't come into work and all of a sudden leave their identities at home. They don't come in and not take the fact that they know that their rights could be stripped away tomorrow to have reproductive health care, that their child that they just dropped off at school could be murdered, that somebody from their racial group was just killed because of the fact of their race. There's so much complexity here in the political, I think, coming into the workspace, and people needing to know, and leadership needing to know, how do you navigate that? How do you have those tough conversations? How do you interrupt microaggressions? How do you create an environment where, one of my other colleagues would say, of human flourishing, but not just of, the white heterosexual male between 40 and 45 who's married and American. Like that's not enabling human flourishing. It's looking at how do we enable all of these different types of groups to be able to flourish within our organizations. And that includes training, whether it's diversity and inclusion training to help people understand their bias and how they might be behaving exclusively. It's understanding how do you navigate microaggressions and building strong teams and making people feel not just like they belong, but also giving everybody equal opportunity to advance. It's understanding how to navigate these tricky political situations. It's also, we talked about empathy. I mean, I probably trained 1,800 people leaders in the last year and a half on inclusive leadership. Over and over again, I said, what is the most important trait that has popped out as important to leaders during the pandemic? And it's empathy. And it's empathy, it's empathy about grief, but it's also understanding that not everybody's lived experience is the same as yours. So that when you walk into the workplace, you might have a car and be able to get to work and you might be healthy, but that might not be the circumstance of somebody else in your workplace. And how do you understand all those different lived experiences? There's also research now that shows that in companies with higher senior leader empathy, innovation is, I think it's like 50% higher, and so is employee engagement. So in companies where senior leaders are expressing high levels of empathy, innovation and engagement goes up, which is higher economic returns financially for the company. So there's all sorts of reasons behind this. I think as we talk about diversity also, I think it's important to look at how new identities are coming into leadership. And so the way that leadership is practiced is different by different populations. And so the whole course I teach, which is called the Women's Leadership Challenge, is about feminist leadership. Because I realized that leadership had always been taught from one frame. And then I worked with women's rights activists across the world. And I was like, wait a second, these women are doing things differently. They're leading in these creative ways. They're creating social change through Google images and plays and all these different ways that I never heard. They're sharing power. So for example, when I talk about power sharing, meaning, the headquarters does not have to be in the US and all operations are run from the US. And then every local office is kind of like second-class citizens. And the CEO sits in the US. Power sharing is, why do we have to have companies that scale to a bazillion people? Why is that the definition of success? Why can't we have multiple companies that are localized? And actually, which leads to more economic redistribution, which is something we need as the gap between the poor and the wealthy increases. So as we look at that too, we're finally seeing leadership change. And so, I'll point to Chile, which I think is a really interesting case, where there was a candidate for president who was literally the son of a Nazi. And there was a candidate for president who's 35 and a student activist. And a student activist who's 35 years old won. A student activist is going to lead in a very different way from the other gentleman. In addition, they're rewriting the Constitution in Chile. And guess who's in charge of the Constitution? 700 people that have been elected by the people to write the new Constitution. And it's led by an indigenous woman. She's going to be paying different attention to the people of Chile than the typical the typical, white male dominant, upper class government. So I think we also have to look at like who the leaders are changing. And with that, I think it's really interesting to dive into their leadership styles and how are they doing things differently from the narrative that we've been told, and in a way where we can stop mass shootings, stop the war in Ukraine, stop, abortion rights being overturned, all these different things that we're seeing today that are just horrific and need to end. And that's why I think the role of the leader needs to change, because we just can't live in the world as it exists anymore. So that's end of my spiel. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Samantha. Barbara Kellerman, can I come to you? You're muted, Barbara.
I thought you were going to unmute me. I was going to say, what if I said no? You said, can I come to you? And what if I said, no, you can't? That would be leadership or bad followership. I'm not sure. Anyway, hello, Will. Nice to see you. And hi there to my colleagues. I'm going to make 4 quick points. I think some of the other panelists have already commented on the title, which is in a way very provocative. In my own view, leadership always changes. The experience of COVID was yet another reason to change. Ukraine changed leadership. Climate change is changing or not changing leadership. In other words, there's change is ubiquitous, change is constant, and I think COVID was simply one more event, arguably a black swan event, but even black swan events are not so black swanish anymore. So I think if you look at the history even of leadership over a period of time, and I know that you, Scott, or Scott Bohannon, I see there are 2 Scotts, referenced history. If you look at human history, leadership is forever changing. So I think that's a given. COVID just yet another contextual event that contributes to that. The second point I'll make is that I am hoping that this panel doesn't focus too much on the leader. Some of you may know that I always talk write in systemic terms. That is, I consider the leader very important, but no more important than those that I call followers. You all have been using different words for it. I agree the word follower is problematic. You can say stakeholders, you can say others, you can say employees, you can say support. I mean, there are a million synonyms for it. I use followers and have for many years, because in English, follower is simply the antonym of leader. So followers have changed. I mean, the level of demands, COVID was a great case in point where after a certain period of time, COVID was diminishing, and leaders, especially in the financial sector, they were at the forefront of saying, okay, guys, you all need to get back to the office. And people said, I don't really think so. I don't really want to go back to the office. And that resulted in what has become known as the Great Resignation. And leaders have had, I'm fond of the example of David Solomon, who's the CEO of Goldman, who had no choice but to backtrack. He said, you need to get back. And people said no. And he went, okay, well, maybe I didn't mean every day. Well, of course, initially he meant every day. So I think it's important to think in systemic terms. What do I consider the components of the system? As I said, leaders are important. They are no more important, in my view, followers. We could have a conversation about that if we're inclined. And the third element, again, of equal importance is the context. How do you understand what happened in consequence of COVID without looking at COVID as a component of the context? So leaders, followers, and context. This is a systemic issue, not simply about leadership. The third point I'll make is that, in my view, what we're really talking about, and I think, Will, what your programs are aimed at, and I think all of you are part of this, I think I'm much less so, how to make good leaders, how to develop good leaders. And I'm big on a certain sequence, which is leadership education, leadership training, and leadership development in that sequence. Each of these has certain meanings, which we're also not going to go into now. But to the larger issue of how do we respond to the challenges that are facing us, I think you have to look at the other professions, see how they train other people, train and educate and teach doctors and lawyers and teachers and plumbers and hairdressers, and we'll have a good idea of what we should be doing, but alas, in general, are not doing with leaders. And the final point I make is that I wouldn't try to shift the conversation. That's not what I'm in the business of doing, but I would raise the issue of bad leadership. Our fixation is always, always on how do you grow good leaders? How do you make good leaders? How do we teach good leaders? It is the focus of what I have for many years called the leadership industry. That's because that's where the money is. But in truth, the world, and God knows we have seen ample evidence of it, we see it every single day, the world is as bedeviled by rotten leaders as it is tantalized by the idea of good leaders. So I think some of the discussion, I don't mean necessarily this one, but in general, the leadership industry should be paying, in my view, much more attention to bad leadership. And I mean the spectrum. I don't just mean, gee, a bad manager in a company. I mean, look what Vladimir Putin has done to us since February 24th, has done to the world, is doing to the world, will be doing to the world. The impact of his single choice on all of us globally is humongous. And for the leadership industry to ignore that kind of thing, in my view, is misleading and misguided.
Thank you, Barbara. And just a quick reminder to the audience, if you'd like to post questions in the Q&A, please do. If you can frame them as a question that can be asked to the panel, that would be appreciated, rather than a comment. If it is a comment, I'm happy to read it out, but I would like to crowdsource some questions as well. But Julianne Shields, if I can come to you.
Sure. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And also, I have learned so much already from Scott, and Kenneth, and Samantha, and Barbara. So thank you. I've learned a ton. I'm going to take a little bit different approach and say that, I believe that being an entrepreneurial leader is increasingly important because of the context of the pandemic. And by entrepreneurial leader, I'm not saying be a leader of a startup. What I'm saying is be very comfortable with ambiguity, clearly. But some of the challenges that come with that, and some of that is being customer focused. I'm going to use the word customer because it's different depending on the context. It could be your customer might be a member, like within our organization, my customer are my members. It could be an audience. It could be, a defined customer, the end customer is who you're creating value for, however it's contextually appropriate for you. So understanding the customer, I think, is incredibly important in a post-pandemic world, because customers have changed their behaviors, their patterns, their values for decision-making are different now. And so as a leader, not only do you need to understand that, but helping all of those that are within your organization also listen empathetically to your customer or to the customer is really important. So it's developing that competency as an organization, I think, is really important as we get through the ambiguity. And entrepreneurial leaders have been doing that for a long time, but it's just, I think that Scott mentioned it, that this is just something that's kind of bringing it out of the IT world, out of the agile world, and pulling it into a bigger forefront. So along with that, the ambiguity and the listening to customers, the other part of being an entrepreneurial leader is a willingness to fail. And a willingness to be comfortable with failure. And I think as a leader, how you react to your own failures is a model for how you react to helping your employees or those that you serve also be comfortable with failure, and recognizing that, let's focus on understanding small failures so that it's not a giant failure that we're dealing with at the end of a year or two. So appreciating, understanding, reflecting on these smaller failures is something that's really important. And again, how you respond to those things, I think, really hits to what Scott Bohannon was talking about with not causing scarcity, not causing fear, embracing that failures are okay and important, and let's be okay with that. And then lastly, I would just mention that the collaborative spirit is ever more important, and sharing of information, including financial information, to help those that are part of your team recognize how they are creating value and what the cost of that value creation is. People are more capable of understanding financials than I think we often give them credit for. And entrepreneurial leaders often share this as a way of I don't know, embracing that none of us is as smart as all of us kind of mentality. Like we all have to be working towards making solutions, and financials and understanding that is an important part of the scenario. And we definitely saw throughout the pandemic, somebody saying, how much are you paying me? I can move to a different place and earn and actually have a better value for myself. So they're making these calculations already for themselves. Why not include them in the overall financial construct of an organization? So those are just my kind of things. Entrepreneurial leadership is one kind of lens through which we might be able to look at this.
Thanks so much, Julianne. Just to let you know, your microphone is a little bit patchy. We could hear you fine, but it was just coming in and out a bit. So okay, we'll now move into the discussion phase. Again, audience, please do post your questions in the Q&A. I've come up with a few questions really to get things started, but panelists as well, please feel free to evolve this into a debate rather than just a question than an answer. So perhaps Kenneth, if I could come back to you. My first question is really, why do we remain so wedded to this notion of leadership as being this sort of universal panacea, as leadership being this essential ingredient to societal and organizational success? Why do we see it as so important? Do the definitions that we have, are they adequate? Do we need, if not to rethink leadership, perhaps to reimagine how we define leadership, for example?
You would pick me first, right? So one of the things you have to look at, and this is a personal thing as I've started to study leadership, is that I believe that since James McGregor Burns in 1978, transformative and transactional leadership, with so many things coming from that and being mixed up in the transaction, I think that what we've done is allow so many other disciplines to dip into leadership that we've kind of lost our way. It's not as pure as it should be. It's not a pure discipline. So the psychologists and the communications and movement and kinetics and all sorts of things, voice analysis have just jumped into leadership. And now everybody thinks their way of doing leadership is the best way. With that, we've added diversity, equity, inclusion, LGBTQ, every kind of way of looking at leadership, when in fact, at a base level, we're all human. And those things that we want, when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, those are the basic things that came out. And that's what COVID showed us. That, and I think one of my colleagues, one of the Scots even said it, leadership doesn't really have to change. We do need to look at it from a point of view of who's delivering it as it relates to race and gender and class and all those things. But in the end, people just want to be safe. And I think COVID kind of pulled the Band-Aid off leadership to show, yeah, it's great that you're telling me I'm getting paid, and it's great that you're telling me you have these wonderful benefits. But in the end, if you don't treat me right as a person, I've decided I will actually forego income and not work at your company. And if leaders don't hear that, it's going to be a tough couple of decades coming. And so we need to get back to the basics of leadership. We need to understand that regardless of how we look at it or what fancy name we give it, it comes down to the transaction between two human beings.
All righty. Thanks, Ken. Scott Bohannon. So Ken's talking about people just want to be safe, and getting back to that transaction between two human beings. What about this original question? The why do we see leadership as so important, as this important ingredient for societal and organizational success?
I had to remember to unmute myself. Sorry, Will.
We all do it.
I think one of the things that we all sense is that leadership is a public good. We don't talk about it that way, but by and large, it's funded like a private good, right? We look for companies and organizations to pay for their people to be trained. And we miss the fact that when somebody leads better, it's not just the benefits that that organization receives, but the other people in that person's life, right? Their community, their family, et cetera. And I think intuitively we get that, right? We get that somebody who leads well in different contexts produces a lot of positive outcomes. I was doing an event years ago with Colin Powell, and he opened up by saying, well, I found in my career the one thing that really matters is leadership. And everybody wrote it down. And I was so frustrated because I'm like, if I said that, you wouldn't write it down, right? But Colin Powell says that you write it down, right? It's just, it didn't sound that extraordinary in the moment. But I kind of missed his point because I was fixated on, myself. And that was that what he was saying is it's rare. It's a lot rare. And if you look at the challenges that we're facing today, what people are experiencing at work, at home, there is so much uncertainty that's out there, right? Julian talked about having to be able to deal with ambiguity. When I started out early in my career, I worked like a crazy person, right? But my work was pretty well behaved, if I'm being honest, right? I had a mentor, somebody who looked after me. I worked hard, but I kind of knew what success looked like and where to go. And that's just not what work's like anymore. And I think we're craving people to help us see through that uncertainty. And leader is the best concept that we have for that. And so I think there's a yearning right now for people who will help us cope with this anxiety that we're feeling at work, the stress that we're feeling, and the cost that it's imposing on us. And I looked last week when I was talking to my employees about what do we say about the attack in Buffalo? What do we talk about the shooting in the Asian church? Like, how do we talk about this? And, I felt helpless, if I'm being honest, because what was I going to say that was going to make anything actually better? What was I going to write the next time this happened, where I didn't even realize the next time would be so quickly right afterwards? And the pressure I felt was that I knew people were looking to me because of my role to be able to help lead through this and give them some measure of hope, right? And yet my toolkit is pretty bare. The only place we could think to go in the moment was to check on each other, which we also found out we weren't doing enough of. Just to check in on people. Back to Kenneth's point about one-to-one, that personal connection, just reaching out to a colleague and saying, how are you doing? Are you doing okay? And I think all of us felt kind of impotent against that. So meandering, but maybe back to it, we think leadership big, but I think a lot of what we're dealing with right now is also just leadership small. I think really love that part of what Kenneth was talking about.
Well, if I might, I'm going to give a slightly different answer to your question.
Please do.
You asked about why we fixate on, I don't think you used the verb fixate, but why we pay so much attention to leaders. I think we underestimate in the field of leadership, in fact, we pay it almost no attention, the role of sociobiology, the nature of the human condition. We are, after all, primates, and primates tend to order themselves hierarchically. We have had enough of human history to know that even in groups that try to be leaderless or, utopian, egalitarian, over time, leaders tend to emerge for various reasons. It, again, is the nature of the human condition. There's a great German sociologist who came up with the phrase, the iron law of oligarchy. The man's name is Robert Mitchell or Mickle. And the iron law of oligarchy is, especially as the group gets larger, the only way of organizing the group and the only way of getting the group's work done is through, again, whatever word you want to give it, but and it's interesting because we've, in recent years, we've come away from the notion of the organizational pyramid, and we talk about flattened hierarchies and empowerment and participation, yada, yada, yada. But in the end, there's always somebody kind of running things, or some group or somebody running things. So I think there's ample evidence to suggest that we are, after all, just primates. And like other primates, we tend to organize ourselves for various reasons having to do with function hierarchically.
Thanks, Barbara. Scott Hilton.
Yeah, I guess I would say that has certainly been the model for 10,000 years, and it'll be hard to fight it. But I do think that we're seeing, in my career arc, a move away from the white guy in the suit in the corner office as the model of leader. I think we'd all agree with that. There are people of color or different personalities, different personality types can now be leaders. So I think we are broadening who we allow to be a leader. I think that has been a big shift. The other thing I think that technology has been a part of this, but I think that the part of the old school command and control leadership was how to marshal the work of, thousands of people to work in factories or in the farm or whatever. And I think we've now are moving back towards a model of the small group. In software, the ideal size of a operating unit is about 6 to 12, because that way they can communicate with each other and share and all that. And that becomes in Agile, that becomes the building block of how you build things and iterate. So I do agree that we will always have leadership, but we will always have to have a method for managing work at scale. But I think it has changed over the last 50 years.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Samantha?
Can you repeat the question again?
So the original question was, why do we see leadership as so important as this universal panacea, this key ingredient to sort of organization and societal success?
Well, I can say with regards to the diversity and inclusion space, leadership is critical. So as a diversity and inclusion consultant, if somebody wants me to go into a company and do training with their employees, if leadership is not bought into that, does not realize the economic return, does not see how valuable it is to retaining employees, which it is, they want check the box training. They want to say, I did something, but they don't really care. And you can tell because it bleeds through the organization. And people feel undervalued, especially people of color who aren't the main, in some circumstances, people of color. I had a woman in a hijab the other day for, a company that's largely Western Europeans. So these people don't feel as valued. And so, I think leadership with regards to diversity and inclusion is really important, and leadership with regards to changing the system. So like one example that I use a lot, but is Adina Friedman. Her decision that if you want to be publicly listed on the stock exchange, you have to have a woman on the board, and now it's a person of color. That was a major decision that only she could make. So yes, you surround yourself with smart people, but ultimately it comes down to the leader saying, okay, what is the right thing to do? What are my values as a leader? What's my ethical compass? What's the legacy that I want to leave as a leader? And what do the people below me want? And so all of that has to be taken into consideration. And then the leader, we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, similar example. 13 Days, great book, surrounded himself with people of all different viewpoints to figure out, what do I do about the Cuban Missile Crisis to prevent nuclear war? Ended up with a naval blockade, but ultimately that came down to him. So I think that's where every leader does need to have a really clear sense of who they are, of their values, of what their people are saying, of what the sentiment is within the company or organization, of what people are complaining about and don't like, of what people love and are like, this is the best thing ever, in order to be able to really effectively lead. But they have to have a clear vision of who they are, so that they are also just not influenced by a bunch of people and then just become a vessel for other people to insert their opinions.
Okay. Thanks, Samantha. Julianne, would you like to address this question? The universal panacea. Why are we so obsessed with leadership?
Will do, and I hope that my audio is a little bit better. I've tried to scoot in a little bit.
It's a little bit better. It's a bit tinny,
Okay.
but it's better. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Oh, that's just my voice. So, I would have to say that one of the things that as adults and working with adults in the education space, I found that it's so important that leaders, whether it's an instructor or just any kind of leader, allows for voice and choice in a way that is inspiring to people. It makes them feel like they are choosing and they're a master of their future. And that's one of the things that I juxtapose that with this kind of cult of personality leadership that has taken hold in some places. And so that's this kind of panacea. What are we really looking for? We're looking for leaders that will ethically embrace this voice and choice, right? I love the, know yourself, understand what's ethically important to you, but also allow all of those within your domain voice and choice in the direction of the organization to serve the greater good, to serve the client, the customer, what have you. So I don't know. I think as individuals and as leaders, figuring out how do we authentically empower or engender voice and choice among those that we are leading, I think is just a critical thing. And it's different for all of us. So I don't know. That's my 2 cents on that one.
Thanks, Julian. I'll come to you with the first question as well.
Okay.
So, in terms of remote working, we've just had a collective experience for the past 2 years, and it continues. The rise of Zoom culture. Some folks have gone an entire work life in a particular workplace, never actually setting foot in the physical space of the organisation. Has that impacted the way leaders need to lead? How has remote leadership, Zoom culture, impacted leadership?
Absolutely. I've got a couple thoughts, but of course it's just contextual based on what I know. I think that what's the word I'm looking for? Being visible and being present, that's always been something that's been important to me as a leader. Is in order to lead well, you need to be visible, you need to be present, you need to be there. And it's very difficult to do that when you're in this remote context. So we've definitely embraced agile and utilizing technology in order to at least be seen, right? Turn your camera on and be a part of that. So the daily touch points are important to a team. But I think the other piece that has been very critical is making sure that there is adequate mentorship for new and young professionals that may not have an intrinsic sense of leadership or intrinsically motivated and might get distracted by the technology. And so this mentorship and this kind of checking in, and not like, hey, are you doing the work? It's more like, how can we help? What is the way that we can help guide you through this? What are you seeing? And doing a lot of empathetic listening as a mentor has been important.
Thanks, Julian. Scott Bohannon, you touched upon this in your 5 minutes. How has remote working, the Zoom culture, changed things?
Well, my day-to-day problem is I've got 180,000 square feet, and on a busy day, I've got 100 people in it, right? Versus hundreds before this. And just the whole feel is radically different now. And I walked over, one of the people had 4,000 square feet to himself, right? And, it's not exactly the experience you're coming to the office for. So I think there's just been a lot of very tactical issues for leaders in the organization about thinking how we organize our calendars. It used to be that it kind of didn't matter what day you did things on, right? Now, well, if we're not making people come to the office, are they going to kind of be there on Tuesday and Wednesday or Wednesday and Thursday? And what do we do on those days? It's just forcing a lot more thoughtfulness about our days and about what the experience is going to be when people come to the office, which we just didn't have to care about before. One of the things that we've recently created, we have a number of employee resource groups. We now have one for remote workers. And it wasn't me or somebody else who created it. It was the remote workers who started thinking of themselves as a campus. And that's, was a smart, interesting development because it's creating some focus in their thinking about, how do they deal with some of the emotions around now the fear of missing out that people are in the office that weren't there before. And it's provided a good channel to many of the more senior folks in the organization to think about what to do differently. But I'd say the big thing is we're having to learn. And there's some big generational differences on this one. The way that different generations are reacting to this change in the workplace for obvious reasons is very different. And it's requiring a lot of patience and a lot of time to explain that, yeah, to you, this seems ridiculous, but other people, this is their whole expectation of work today and what it looks like. So I think the short version is a lot of patience, a lot of listening, a lot of learning, and just making small incremental changes to keep getting better and better. Thanks,
Scott. Samantha, if we come to you, this idea of the hybrid workplace, of greater flexibility, you touched upon this in your 5 minutes as well. Has this created an environment that's more amenable to women in leadership, for example? Has it made it more accessible, more equitable in terms of leadership?
Women in general, yes. Um, it was funny. I remember there was a company that I was consulting to before the pandemic as a financial firm, and they said the women here, like they all want flexible work, but like no one's ever going to do that. And it was like, it's off the table. Don't even present that to senior leadership. And then, I mean, this was literally 2 months before the pandemic. And obviously they all showed that they could do their jobs from home. So there is a huge benefit to flexible work for women, especially women that have just had a child and are breastfeeding, because there may not be the privacy, the resources, the areas to pump that women need to do if they're breastfeeding or they're sick in pregnancy. I will say what's been interesting, I've been doing a lot of women's empowerment workshops lately for companies, is women expressing, though, that now as we come back to hybrid work, that some of the women, especially if they have young kids, want to stay home more. But what they're worried about is that if other people are going into the office, that they're going to be missed out on and that they're not going to be considered. So, you know, like when I always talk about inclusive meetings, we now have to deal with hybrid, where some people might be on Zoom and some people might be on phone and some people might be in the conference room and some people on their laptops. It's harder and it takes more time, but you have to individually not just say, oh, these people sitting here in front of me, I'm going to ask what they think, but I'm going to also ask like whoever is on the line to exercise what they think and make sure I'm still trying to include those voices, even if they're not physically present. I would say the other thing that we can't ignore is the she session. And that, you know, finally schools are back, but the amount of women that left the workforce because the unpaid care burden was so incredibly high with, you know, even if you're flexible working, managing a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old and trying to make sure they're paying attention to online school while you're trying to work, whether you're home or at the office, is very, very challenging. And so the number of women that left the workforce is unbelievably dramatic. And we still see schools closing and, you know, COVID scares, and the 80% of working mothers took on the burden of helping their kids with school versus 30% of working fathers.
Thanks, Samantha. Ken, on the same point, has more flexible work practices, hybrid working, remote leadership, has it made leadership more accessible than in the past?
I think so. My business has picked up significantly after COVID and during COVID. And so I think that the use of the remote worker, it's funny when Samantha was mentioning it, I thought, what's the pushback to remote work? Like, that's my question. What's the pushback? Is it the real estate depreciation that's missed? Is it the fact that I spent so much money on the real estate and there's nobody in it that I wasted it? Or can we find an alternative to it? And instead of doing that, we just want to push everybody back to work. And so I think remote work is probably the best thing that's happened to the business industry. Now, on the women's front, my wife is a registered nurse. She did everything from home, but it was different. I think she made more of an impact because she works in oncology. So she only works with women who have been diagnosed or are going through breast cancer. So for her to be able to have contact 24 hours a day made her job that much more meaningful. It also showed what women actually go through when they're at home taking care of 4 kids and cooking or doing whatever they do, and that it made us more amenable to being, and I think Scott Hilton talked about it, and even Scott, but being more empathetic at how we treat workers. I think remote work is here to stay. I embrace it. I enjoy it. And leaders should probably figure out a way to deal with it, or they're going to be losing a lot of employees.
All right. Thanks, Ken. Scott Hilton, on this point?
Yeah, obviously it's here to stay. You know, I've talked with many people. Having your team all in the office works. We've done that that's been our standard model. Having everybody remote, we just went through that works. What's the hardest is hybrid, where 5 people are around the conference table and the whiteboard, and the other 3 are on a telephone or on a screen. And I think that's the thing that we're struggling with as we re-enter this hybrid world, is how to make the middle part work. And I will submit, any leader out there, the first thing you should consider is be the remote in these meetings. You're going to want to go to the office and sit in a room with everybody and be the leader. But guess what? The best thing you can do is be on the phone or on the Zoom, and that will draw people. That will show that hybrid and the remote people are as important as the people in the room. So just a small suggestion for anybody who's a leader: be the remote person in these hybrid situations. Don't be the one in the office. The other thing I would, somebody kind of mentioned around the real estate, I think companies are going to start rethinking where they spend money on supporting their workers, and the office space will become a lesser important thing than experiences, and working on ways of bringing teams together, either virtually or remotely or in person. Like, take your budget, and rather than 100,000 square feet of prime real estate, what if you had 30,000 and could spend some of that budget on bringing people together in experiences where they bond together even more tightly than standing at the coffee stand. So I think people are going to rethink where they spend their money in support of training and mentoring and bringing teams together.
Thanks, Scott. Barbara, if I could change the direction slightly.
Damn it. Will, I had such a brilliant answer to your
question.
Oh,
please carry on.
Okay, so I was going to turn the question at you. I was going to ask you to comment. You're the leader of this panel. You pulled us together. You're the facilitator. How is the experience for you of trying to lead us, facilitate us, gather us remotely? This is a little mini case in point in real time. So you can maybe comment, and then I'm happy to answer your other question.
Honestly, I think logistically and conceptually, it's far easier to pull an online panel together than it is an actual panel. There's less having to provide facilities, muffins, coffee, getting people's schedules organized, coming in from different places. But
is it better?
I think
is this panel, and we've now been together, whatever, maybe half the time or more even. Do you feel that the quality of our exchange is in any way either negatively or positively impacted by our being I've never met any of you. Well, not even you, Will. I've worked with you, but I haven't really met any of you. Does that matter? Or is it just as we all get that it's easier? But is it better, worse, or probably the same?
In one respect, it's probably pretty much the same. If you can overcome the logistical issues, then getting 6 people of the caliber that we've got here, whether or not actually in the flesh picking up on the cues, and whether or not the debate would flow a little more seamlessly, perhaps, than it does in the online space, I think that's a different matter. But I've been doing these debates previously for Albany Law and now here, and they do tend to be pretty good, and probably as the equal of if we'd managed to get everybody in the actual physical space as well.
And Will, we would have never gotten 98 people into Medford.
We would not.
So that's another indicator of the value of this, is that the audience can be better and doesn't have to be constrained by a place.
Yeah, maybe when the Green Line extension eventually reaches us, that would be different. But, so thank you for your question to me, Barbara. So my question to you, you've written a lot about followership and the importance of followership and the sort of deficit in terms of the attention to followership. In your 5 minutes, you mentioned the Great Resignation. Or the Great Regret, as some call, but either way, we had a period called the Great Resignation. Did that alter the balance of power between leaders and followers in any way, or was it just part of what has been an ongoing process?
So, Will, I'll give you a few quick responses. First of all, let's be clear. We're talking about a very particular group of people. Largely, we're talking about the United States and the Western world. And largely, we're talking about office workers, as opposed to, it's one thing to be consultant for oncology, but there are a lot of nurses that need to go into the workplace, caretakers, cooks, and restaurants struggling to get staff because if they're going to run, they need people physically present until we've gone totally robot. So we're talking about a very particular group of leaders and followers. With regard to follower, I've because of some other work I'm doing, I have started collecting articles. I read 3 papers every day, the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. I've started collecting articles on what employers are doing to keep, in other words, quote, leaders are doing to keep their people happy, to keep followers happy. So for the moment, and there's also obviously a bit of a labor shortage. So for the moment, it's a very complicated question, Will, because as we know, the union movement I'm talking now the United States, is miserably inadequate and has miserably declined. So on one level, followers, workers, in terms of wages and rights and privileges, are much worse off than they were. The gap between the pay rate of a CEO and an average employee is gotten to be obscenely monstrous, is no other way to put it. But on another level, in the short term, it is also true that companies, leaders, managers, in order for them to keep their employees happy, they are giving them all kinds of perks and benefits that they were not 3 years ago. And that includes wage increases, more vacation time, insisting actually that you take some vacation, in some cases unheard of previously, that kind of thing. So in certain ways, and for this moment in time, yes, but again, my larger argument is that over time, leaders have gotten less power and authority than they did in the past, and followers have gotten more. But obviously, the way I look at all of this, it's extremely complicated. And I'm always talking about the political space as well as the private sector.
Thanks, Barbara. Julia, what's your perspective? Has the relationship between the leader and the led, or whether we call them followers, stakeholders, employees, or whatever, has that altered? Has the balance of power altered?
My belief is that it has. I think there's definitely a sense that it's hard to recruit. I used to be in recruiting. I know the cost of recruiting talent. It's much easier to retain good talent. And one of the strategies now is to listen and be more empathetic and to provide better opportunities and benefits. And it's probably a pendulum, though, to be very honest with you, because when the pendulum swings back, some of those things may go away. I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying that I don't know how authentic this leadership shift really is, and if it's I hope it's something that we've learned that we will keep, but the proof is going to be in the pudding on that one.
I just want to bring in some of the Q&A questions, and Julian, I'll stay on you for this one. Ryan Wasserman is asking about there's been a number of very high-profile layoffs recently. How does a leader fulfill the requirements of stakeholders in terms of shareholders and the business, whilst also being caring and empathetic to their employees? How does good leadership deal with that sort of situation?
Well, I do think that in the context of a business, and there is financial scarcity in some ways. And so in order for the business to continue and for people to continue to be employed, sometimes that does mean cuts. I've got a colleague of mine at a university. They're going through program prioritization, which means that there are tenured faculty who are losing their jobs, and it's very stressful and unusual. And but the reality is these are things that probably needed to be done before the pandemic, but the can just kept getting kicked down. And so, but in order for the organization to survive, they need to have a stronger financial footing. At the end of the day, that is an important, a critically important thing to do and to consider. And right now in particular, this is a great time to be looking. It sounds terrible, but there's a lot of opportunity out there for people to look and to shift their career choices and to have new opportunities. So at the moment, this is not a bad time to be let go, and you can work remotely in many cases. So that's my 2 cents. The financial considerations are critically important to the health of an organization, whether it's for shareholders or just for the overall good of the organization.
Thanks, Julianne. This next question from Jerry Brightman. Actually, Scott Bohannon, looks like you might have just answered it.
It did, yes.
So it disappeared. But he asks another one. Jerry Brightman is a member of faculty here at the Gordon Institute. So 20 years ago, there was a great enthusiasm for the notion of the learning organisation. Today, do you think this is a real possibility for leaders and leadership going forward?
Sorry, was that still to me?
Sorry, that was, yeah.
Okay, sorry, yeah, no problem. Sorry. I think you're going to die if you're not a learning organization these days, to be honest. I don't think it's negotiable. You go back through most of human history, and the 2 things that helped us deal with ambiguity were discovery and relationships, right? I mean, those are just the defining issues. You have to be in a constant state of discovery, and you've got to be maintaining relationships to deal with uncertainty. I think the challenge is that we're wired, right, to reject the evidence that says we're wrong. And I think one of the keys to being a learning organization is for leaders to set the expectation that we're actively looking for the evidence that we're wrong and embracing the evidence that says we are. I think it's a huge part of psychological safety, that you need to create so that people can put their hand up and say, whoa, this is not what I thought. This is different, and be curious about that and excited about sharing it rather than afraid of what the consequences will be. So I think we have to get there, but I also think it fights against a lot of our basic nature.
Thanks, Scott. Samantha, the question here specifically for you from Anna Milenkovic, which I probably mispronounced, my apologies. What are some of the feminist leadership principles you think male leaders should adopt in the future? We hear over and over again that women need to act or lead more like men to get ahead in the workplace. So interested in what the opposite lessons might be.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So I think this is the worst possible thing. And this is why there was so much pushback to Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, because it kind of was like, let's work within the system, even if it sucks for women, and figure out how to act like men to get ahead in a system designed by men, versus systems change leadership, which is how do we change the system to be more friendly to women and to other marginalized voices? And then how do we, as leaders, kind of push against that norm with our own behavior? So some of those behaviors, for example, are self-care, taking care of oneself, not working a bazillion hours, and prioritizing care for others, and showing, like we were just talking about, forcing people to take vacation time, robust maternity and paternity leave, nursing stations for women, taking care of women that are, Spain just passed a menstrual leave policy, which was pretty cool. Like when you're on your period, you can have 3 days off. Like, I don't think men would think of that. I'm going to be honest. Things like collaboration, transparency, triple bottom lines, putting people before profits. An aspect of feminist leadership that I talk about is called start where you stand, which answers another question here, is that not waiting until you're the CEO or you're the prime minister to lead on something. There's so many ways now. I mean, Greta Thunberg sat outside Parliament with a freaking sign, and all of a sudden she started a giant climate movement. Like, she wasn't, the head of the G7. There's so many ways now that you can create change. Nike, a bunch of women saw that there was sexual harassment happening. No one was paying attention. They ran a survey by themselves, got the results, stuck it on the CEO's desk. All the senior leadership was fired and replaced. I mean, there's ways that you can create change without being in charge. So that's another principle. I think taking action and using corporate power to push change on women's rights. Like, I love what Bumble's doing. They have a whole policy arm dedicated to changing legislation around women's cyberbullying against women and cyber flashing. They've used their corporate power and their resources, their money, to fight for women's rights changes in Congress. I mean, not just, whatever normally tech companies would be caring about. Also, like taking stands on issues like gun violence, abortion, student debt. Another aspect of feminist leadership is that knowing that the leader doesn't know everything. So in the women's leadership class I teach, it's only 8 women. And what I like to say is that I'm the guide, but I opened lots of space for the women to participate and say, okay, here's the theory and framework I set forward. What do you think? What's it been like in your experience? Push back against me instead of me just lecturing for 2.5 hours and assuming that I'm the smartest person in the room. Another aspect is like co-design, not just like designing, thinking that you know everything about the customer, but designing with the customer and inclusive design. So why is Siri and Alexa's voices women? Reperpetuation of the patriarchy, having inclusive design and understanding that customers are as diverse as our employees. Those are some aspects, and hopefully my book that will, pray will be published, will be out next year and dive more into that. But my women's leadership course is really how I teach all of this, where I teach all of it.
Thanks, Samantha.
Just a small point, Samantha, I think the whole mentoring and building community within companies is another thing that I think is the difference between men and women, right? I think that is a big thing that really helps an organization, is building community within the organization.
Love that.
Thanks, Scott. Ken, a question for you. This is from Anna Cecilia Perez. What can we do when leading people who are hurt in different ways and haven't the tools to be resilient after what the pandemic made them go through? I think you touched upon empathy and those sorts of factors.
I think we need to make sure that we understand where people are and their experiences. I'm what I would call hyper sensitive to it because I spent 28 years in law enforcement. And so I was a police officer, police sergeant, police lieutenant. I was at a command level. And after I retired, I had to think, why am I experiencing these things? And when I go to work, why is it that I'm feeling why people treat me a certain way or say a certain thing or do a certain thing, but they don't really know they're doing it. And it's not really wrong, it's just different. What is that? And I had to go back and I found out that from the time I went into law enforcement to today, I had either been at a scene where someone died, supervised a scene where someone died, or signed a report where someone died, sometimes multiple deaths every week for that time. But what it led me to be is, such and such happened. And I went, okay. And I got this cold, well, why are you so distant? It's not that I'm distant, I'm desensitized. And I think that's what happens in the workplace. We become so desensitized to things that happen to other people that we just don't grasp it. And we have to, and I don't know who said it, we have to just start listening and connecting what you're saying. Now, I think Samantha said, you get 3 days off, right? If you're having your period. That's not hard for a guy to show empathy for, but only if he's married and has daughters, right? And so we have to start looking at what are those commonalities we have with people and help them through their tragedy or help them through their problem and their hurtness, but then we have to actually talk about it. On the flip side, we can't blame middle class and upper middle class white males for everything that's gone on and gone bad in the world. At some point, you still need to take responsibility and accountability for your mess ups. And that's why I talk about it, self-leadership. What's your self-punishment? Like, how do you recognize, wow, I'm probably going through something because 95% of my issue I created. Someone else may have taken advantage of it, but I created it and I have to help fix it. And so with that, I think it's just important that if you're going to help somebody that's hurt, you need to have as many tools in your toolbox as possible. Therapy, coaching, counseling, mentoring, but really it's going to start with just simply listening.
Thanks, Ken. Scott Hilton, if I can come to you again, changing the emphasis slightly. You talked about the idea of sort of self-management, self-organized teams, flatter organizations. What does the rise of self-organized, self-managed, self-directed teams mean for the conduct of leadership? And as you said, it's been present within software and other sectors before now, and now it's becoming elsewhere. What does it mean for the conduct of leadership?
Well, I think it changes what the leader has to do and what is expected of them. Like I kind of set it up as, you're not directing what people do anymore, right? You're enabling the situation or the environment for them to succeed, either as individuals or as a team. And I will go back to, something that Julian mentioned earlier. Like, I think another big shift has been the focus towards customers, internal customers and external customers, as the guiding force, the North Star for how organizations behave, how teams behave. But anyway, for the leader, it means you're focused on setting a vision, creating ways of inspiring people to take risks, as Julian said, to fail, make it not the end of your career if you fail. I had a principle which was to fail early, because the pain of failing late is really bad. The pain of failing early and experimenting is low. So I really focused on taking risk early, so that you, one, have the best outcome at the end. You have to be a change catalyst. Somebody else said it, like, you need to be looking for ways of enhancing the environment, of being more inclusive, but also of recognizing when things aren't going well, even things that you believe in or think are good. You have to build a culture of trust and of safety. Somebody mentioned it, psychological safety, that every person in the organization should feel free and non-judgmented in bringing up a topic or pushing back on a decision or bringing a different perspective. If you don't build that, people are just going to hunker down, and you're going to miss out on all that talent, all that idea, all that life experience. So you have to be the one that creates that safe space as a leader. And another thing is, I think a growing emphasis is on investing in your team. We always had training and but I think between the Great Resignation and the reality that that people, I think, generationally want to continue to be in a continuous learning curve. So investing in your people is also something that you are responsible for. So rather than just directing work and telling people what to do, you're now an enabler.
Outcomes, not output, I believe you said.
Outcomes, not output.
Will,
Thanks.
might
Barbara.
I make I want to talk, I'm directing this comment at you, Scott Hilton. It's interesting to me that you have used the word enabler several times in your comments in the last hour and a half. And I have, just for the record, my last book is titled The Enablers. And I use the term diametrically opposed to how you use it.
Oh,
in other words, I'm using it almost in a therapeutic sense, meaning you're enabling somebody who's addicted or somebody who's in trouble. So we're both using the word enabler in the leadership space, but we're using it in completely opposite ways, just for the record. Sorry, Will, didn't mean to derail your thread here.
So Barbara, what's a good word that separates those two?
Well, I look before I decided to title the book "The Enablers," and there's a subtitle which I won't mention now. I actually looked it up because of exactly the difference that we're having here, and I think the primary use of it is mine. But you're absolutely right that it can also mean I'm helping somebody do something in the most constructive possible way. But it is interesting that in this relatively narrow space, leadership studies or leadership work, we happen by chance, of course, to be using the word, again, in totally different ways.
Yeah. The other thing is it's been called a bunch of stuff, as we all know, like servant leader, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
So it has had many different variants of it over the years. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Barbara. We've got just 6 minutes left, and there are six of you. If I could ask in those remaining 6 minutes, my final question is, what do you see as the key trends shaping the role of leadership now? Gazing into the crystal ball, what do you see as important for the future? If you could give me a response in a minute or less. Ken, do you want to start us off?
Recognizing the generational shift that's going to be needed in order for those that are baby boomers and old Gen X to let go.
Thanks, Ken. Barbara?
You're going to hate my answer, Will, because I'm going to reply, it depends. You know, these kinds of generic questions I'm reluctant to answer because it's driven by context. What's going to be most important in the political sphere is not necessarily going to be most important in the corporate sector or in the religious sector or in education. Obviously, there are some overarching trends, but they also can shift. I think it's very difficult to predict into the future that this is going to apply across the board. I will simply say, in my last sentence or two, that there are some overweening issues. Somebody earlier mentioned climate change. I'll use that as an example where the effort to exercise good leadership has so far come to just about nothing. And it is interesting to me to see how many calamities will have to happen before the world. I mean, we can't lead on climate change without China, without India. This is a global effort, and the lack of an instrument, a tool to exercise global leadership on a topic that is so important and so threatening is going to be interesting to watch probably in a very negative way for a long time to come.
Thanks, Barbara. Samantha?
I'm going to lead off of Barbara's point. I do think that global leadership is incredibly important. That collaborating across borders, climate change is the obvious example, but something that I thought was really interesting, the war in Ukraine, was the first time that so many EU member states came together in a unified way to implement sanctions against Russia. Even Switzerland, which is usually very reluctant to do something like that. And so that type of cross collaboration across borders, and also learning from other countries. Like in America, sometimes we just think we're the best at everything. And the reason RBG realized that gender equity could happen in the legal system was because she went to Sweden and saw that it was happening there. And so we also have to get rid of our Western imperialist, we're better at this than everybody. I'll give a quick example. There's an African country where they have a mental health crisis, and they train grandmothers who don't have anything to do how to be mental health counselors, and the grandmas sit on benches, and people know that they can go sit and talk to the grandmas. That's a non-traditional way of approaching this, but it's really effective within that context. So I also think we need to look outside of our sphere for some of these answers.
Thanks, Samantha. Scott Bohannon?
So I think one of the best things someone who's leading can do is to find ways to get out of zero-sum gains. Right. It's all too often we see who wins and loses. The two big areas that I think we're going to be contending with, at least most in the corporate world, I'd argue more broadly, will be one, dealing with boundaries. Right. We're just seeing such an incredible increase in boundaries of all kinds, whether it's in the political realm, geopolitical space, more things that are dividing us. And leadership is going to be a huge part about both small and big, about figuring out how do we transcend those boundaries? How are we going to help people who see things very differently take positive action along the way? And the other part of it would be the obvious: environmental, social, and governance. But I think the big one's going to be on the social element, because we are talking a lot about environmental. There is a lot of action, whether it's productive, at least in dialogue on that front. But I think we're kind of lost to a degree on what to do on the social front. We're really struggling with what that dialogue and that language looks like right now. And so I think that's going to be a big area of focus for leaders.
Thanks, Scott. Scott Hilton?
Yeah, I think the one thing I'm thinking a lot about is I think about the impact of automation on how we've structured work. And I think we're going to see over the next 10 years a rapid bringing in of automation into sectors that we'd never even considered, and that's going to have a huge impact on workforce, where training, what all these people are going to do. So that's, if I were a leader looking forward, I'd try to understand how automation is going to affect my world.
Thanks, Scott. And finally, Julianne.
Mine actually kicks right off of Scott's in many ways. Resiliency, I think, is going to be important. It pulls in the ESG type of things, but it's really being authentic, thoughtful, and brave in the face of rapidly changing things. So,
Thanks, Julianne. Well, that's exactly 2 o'clock. So thank you for all of you sticking to the time. What an awesome panel you have been. I think this was an interesting debate. We covered a lot of things, and I think it was an apt part of the celebration of the 30th year of the Tufts Gordon Institute. Thanks for being a part of it. Thank you so much to Scott Bohannon. Thank you to Kenneth Harris. Thank you to Scott Hilton, Samantha Carlin, Barbara Kellerman, and Julian Shields. We appreciate you giving your time and your expertise to us. And thank you to those of you in the audience as well. Thanks for joining us. For those of you asking questions, we did manage to answer a few, but thanks so much for giving us those questions. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and also enjoy the summer ahead. Goodbye.
Thank you.